Wow, thank you so much for a wonderful welcome, and thank you so much for coming along. It's a real honour for us to be here today, especially for me. This is actually a very personal subject, very personal to my heart and to my own life, so I'm actually very delighted to be sharing this with all of you today. First of all, I just want to tell you a little bit about why this series of lectures are being sponsored by an association called AMAL. So AMAL is a project that's been developed by the Said Foundation. It makes grants and in support of Muslim cultural production in the UK, providing opportunities for people in Britain, regardless of their faith or beliefs, to come together and explore the rich diversity of Muslim cultures and arts. Its objective is to help increase understanding between Britain's Muslim and non-Muslim communities, and thereby add to the strength and vitality of contemporary British society. In this pilot year, AMAL supported activities to go on at festivals, art centres, theatres, schools, places of worship, and in the community. In all its work, AMAL is guided by the values of conviviality, compassion, and social justice. So that's very apt in terms of Morris's own values. So it's an incredible initiative, and we're really delighted that our lecture today and our discussions today are sponsored by them. So a big thanks to AMAL for making this happen for us. We're going to hear, first of all, from Rowan Bain, who is the curator at the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow. She's recently authored a book on Mae Morris, on the life of Mae Morris, William Morris's daughter, Mae Morris, arts and craft designer. And the exhibition on Mae Morris's life is currently at the gallery till the 28th of January. Rowan has a particular interest in historic textiles and dress, and she was, before the William Morris Gallery, she was actually at the V&A, and she's going to give her perspective on the subject. Thank you.
Okay. So welcome everybody, thank you. It's a great turnout. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with William Morris. You have the wonderful Wilson just up the road. And I'm sure many of you might even have William Morris patterns in your house, maybe wallpaper or textiles. So I come from the William Morris Gallery, which is in Walthamstow in East London, and this is where William Morris was born. Sorry, not born. He was born in the area, but he lived here in the gallery that is now when he was a teenager. So he was born in 1834, and he was the eldest of a family of 10. So he came from a very wealthy family. And this area was very rural at the time, so it was surrounded by fields. And William Morris, when he talked about his childhood, he talked a lot about being inspired by this landscape, the Epping Forest nearby, which he rode around on a pony. And so he often talked about the kind of English landscape and how we often think of his textiles and his patterns being so inspired by this. But of course, today we're going to talk about a different inspiration, different traditions that he also took inspiration from. So Morris actually started his life, and he was going to become a member of the clergy. And he went to Oxford University, and it was here that things started forming in his mind, and he started to change his direction. So a major point in this period is John Ruskin, and he has, at this point, produces his book, The Stones of Venice, which is to have a huge impact on the way Morris thinks about design and starts to think about how people make things and how the environment around him has been made and how it becomes beautiful. So Morris is particularly inspired by the chapter on the nature of Gothic. And this comes together in his mind because he's also visiting Northern Europe in the university holidays. So he's looking at the architecture of Northern Europe and these beautiful Gothic cathedrals and thinking about the guilds that have made the architecture around him. And so he starts to think about these crafts guilds and artisans who have formed themselves together to protect the quality and craftsmanship of the architecture and beautiful things that have been made, and also to ensure that there's a high standard of craftsmanship. So these ideas are all forming in his head, And he also befriends the artist Edward Burne-Jones, later on to become an artist, but at that point, like Morris, is studying to become a member of the clergy. So all these things come together, and it's on one of these visits to Europe on his last day that him and Edward Burne-Jones were walking along the quayside in France, and they decide to abandon their careers in the clergy and dedicate themselves to art instead, much to the displeasure of his mother, of course. So Morris sets out and to become an artist. He initially thinks he's going to become an architect and becomes an apprentice in an architect's firm. Later, he meets Rossetti, who persuades him that he should actually become an artist. And it's not until he gets married and actually builds his first house, Red House in Bexley Heath, which you can see here, built by his friend, the architect Philip Webb, that he's looking around and thinking about furniture that can fill this house. And there's nothing that really fits the style. He's so interested in the medieval period, but at the time, obviously, Victorian furniture and craft and design is so different, so at odds with how he wants to see his house filled. So he actually sets up his first business called Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co. They are the names of the business partners. Now, the business sets up in 1861, and they gain some success, mainly because they exhibit in the International Exhibition of 1862. And it's at the exhibition that they start to get some prizes, and they obviously come to the attention. Now, it's interesting in the context of this conversation to think about him exhibiting in an exhibition like this, which is showcasing art and design from all around the world. And we know that Egypt and the Ottoman Empire had displays at this exhibition. We don't know what Morris thought about that. He didn't comment on it, but he must have seen these displays. And this exhibition forms what becomes the V&A. Now, 10 years before, 11 years before, the Great Exhibition is in London, and Morris visited it as a teenager, but he was very scathing and didn't want to go inside. So even at a young age, he was dismissive of what he thought was bad taste. He described it as wonderfully ugly. And actually, Morris's hero, Ruskin, had said, if any lesson is to be drawn from the Great Exhibition, it's that design in the hands of a machine-minded, money-seeking generation tends to take a downward curve. Now, obviously, Morris had changed his mind when he decided to exhibit in the 1862 exhibition, and clearly when he won prizes, it obviously changed his view even more. So the business gets success from things like this. They get the commission to decorate one of the rooms of the V&A's cafe, which I'm sure many of you might have enjoyed a coffee in. And he starts to make stained glass and wallpapers and of course, textiles. Now, these are a few of his well-known designs. Now, Morris is now admired, I suppose, for his ability to capture natural forms. Through his first experiments with embroidery, through to much more intricate designs exemplified through the textiles and wallpapers that we know today. Now, these birds and flowers and leaves that we are so familiar with are so associated with the English countryside. So plants like willows and acanthus, thrushes and strawberries suddenly appear on the walls of our homes throughout Britain. Here, chrysanthemum and strawberry thief, which the eagle-eyed people will see on Navid's shirt. Now, but Morris is looking beyond just what he sees around him in his immediate environment, and he actually collects textiles and decorative arts from around the world, particularly India and the Middle East. Now, Morris often collects things because he's interested in how things are made, and this is what makes Morris such a successful designer, because he has an understanding of the limitations and potentials of what he's designing for. So by making, he can understand what he's then designing for. Now, for example, this textile, Brother Rabbit, of course, rabbits from the English countryside, but the indigo blue is inspired by Indian textiles, and he admires the Indian textiles and the quality of blue that Indian craftspeople have managed to attain, and he tries to copy that and emulate it, and uses this colour strongly in many of his textiles. He also collected Kadhai embroideries and Ottoman embroideries. And many of, well, not many, but some of these now exist in Birmingham Museum. And this is a photograph of a Kadhai embroidery. It actually has his daughter's name on it, so we think that she had this textile. And it's part of a whole series. And you can see here in this photo, in the top right photo, it's actually the back has been unpicked. And we know that Morris and his wife Jane, who was an expert needlewoman, and May, his daughter, would unpick historic textiles. They could see the back and they could see and work out the stitches. So he's always working out how things are made, and so he can work out how to use them in his own work. Now, he was inspired by the way things were made, but also patterns and techniques. So when he talked of Persia in particular, which the designs he so admired, he said, "To us pattern designers, Persia has become a holy land. For there is in the process of time our art was perfected, and thence above all places it spread to cover for a while across the world, the east and the west." Now, these influences clearly show themselves in the patterns, and Kaiser is going to look in more detail at this. So textiles like snake's head and peacock and dragon. Now, you can see here how Morris takes these natural forms, but crucially, he turns them into flat patterns. Now, this is what Morris is such an expert at. So rather than try and recreate in a 3D way the natural world around him, he tries to make it appropriate for the surface. So a flat pattern should suit the flat surface that he's designing for. He doesn't use shadow. He uses shading instead. And these are all dictums that are evident in Middle Eastern design. Now, I mentioned that he's collecting. So here we have an example of his house in Hammersmith, and you can see the beautiful carpet that's hanging from his ceiling and down the wall. Now, this is a very, very large room, double height room, because you can see the door in the corner, how the normal height of a door, and how huge this carpet is. Now, Morris shocked the people that would visit his house, because at that time, carpets are meant for the floor, and Morris is hanging them from his walls or even putting them on tables, and this was very shocking to Victorian taste. They obviously thought this is a floor covering, you shouldn't have it on your wall. And you can see below as well, he's got examples of metalwork from Iran, and you can see ceramics on the surfaces. And again, in this watercolour by his daughter May, which shows their drawing room, you can see the Iznik Ceramics lined up on the mantel shelf and a carpet on the table. So he was displaying them in his home. He was going to the Victoria and Albert Museum to study them. And he actually was one of 41 lenders to lend his collection to an 1885 exhibition of Islamic art at the Burlington Fine Arts Club. This is something that Morris is always interested in. He doesn't just have art for himself. He wants everybody to enjoy and appreciate design. And he really understands the value of exhibitions and galleries for doing this. So we'll touch a bit on carpets. So you can see that he's collecting carpets himself, but he also starts to experiment with making carpets. He said in 1877 to a friend, "I saw yesterday a piece of ancient Persian, time of Shah Abbas, our Elizabeth's time, that fairly threw me on my back. I had no idea that such wonders could be done in carpets." So he was going to the showrooms in London, people like Vincent Robinson, who were dealers in carpets, and he was studying technique and colour and design. And he puts all of this into his own carpet designs. Now, initially, they're quite crude. He starts to experiment, and he makes them himself in his own house. And then he gets more sophisticated. And he is always interested in natural dyes. And so here, this example, Peacock and Bird, which is a later carpet, where he's really started to become more sophisticated. And these deep reds and blues that he's taken from carpets that he's seen. Now, although he's very inspired by Persian carpets and the quality, his own carpets are... he doesn't use such a sophisticated carpet knotting. They're all hand knotted. And whereas Persian carpets might be 200 knots per inch, Morris's carpets are around 25 knots per inch. So that's for the carpet nerds out there. He would use naturally dyed yarns, and he would use it to create these three-dimensional effects, but also very flat blocks of colour. So he said that design should always be elementary in form, suggestive merely of forms of leafage, flowers, beasts and birds. And he said, I must have unmistakable suggestion of gardens and fields and strange trees, boughs and tendrils, or I can't do with your pattern. So here, the flying birds aren't particularly meant to represent any kind of particular species, but they're stylized, and the colors are chosen to kind of harmonize with the overall design, rather than trying to recreate nature itself. So he is collecting Persian carpets and also has a very influential role in the museums and the collections that we now see today, in particular the V&A. So he became an art advisor for the V&A, then called the South Kensington Museum, and he is responsible for the purchase of this carpet. Now, some of you who have visited the V&A might know this carpet. It's the Ardabil carpet, and it's one of the largest carpets probably many of you will see. Now, at the time when this was acquired, it came from now modern-day Azerbaijan, and it had been in a shrine, and the shrine had suffered an earthquake, and there were two carpets, and they were sold to a Manchester carpet firm, and this one was then put up for sale in 1892. Now, Morris advises the V&A to buy this, and he says he described it as a remarkable work of art. It's singular in its perfection. Its size and splendor as a piece of workmanship do full justice to the beauty and intellectual qualities of design. And as an art referee, so he's telling them advising them what they should buy, he advises them to pay the hefty sum of £2,000 to purchase this carpet. And the public, it's public conscription, and they raise the money, and now the carpet is one of the prized possessions of the V&A. He is also, going back to this photo, interested in collecting pottery and ceramics, and I'll just touch on this briefly. Morris kind of experiments with making ceramics, but he's never really able to achieve the quality that his friend William de Morgan achieves. So actually he sells de Morgan's pottery in his shop. Now, de Morgan is very inspired by Islamic pottery, particularly Iznik and Spanish lusterware, and he achieves a great quality, and Morris is impressed by this and decides to sell the work in his shop. And this is an interior photo of Morris's shop, and you can see here how the carpet on the floor, he would have original carpets from Persia and Turkey, and he would have ceramics and Persian ceramics out on display. And one visitor for the shop said, "There are lovely things at every turn, Persian potteries, hangings of every variety, cabinets and rugs, and I fell in love with a sunflower paper at 4p halfpenny a yard." So just like Liberty, which was round the corner, the shop was a place where you weren't just going to buy products, but you were looking to aspire to the good taste and the aesthetics that people like Morris was trying to promote, and the design and the aspirations that he saw through Middle Eastern design. So in his later life, he moves away from his business, and he becomes a full-time socialist. But he continues to collect, and this is going back. This is an example of a De Morgan tile panel for you. But at the end of his life, he clearly has his interest in historic collection textiles is so close to him. This is a photograph of the Ottoman Velvet that was draped over Morris's coffin after he died, and his coffin was taken on a cart from London through to Kelmscott in Oxfordshire. I'm sure many of you might have visited. And this textile lay over his coffin, so not one of his own designs, but a beautiful Ottoman velvet, which is now in Birmingham. So I will now hand over to Naveed again.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rowan. Our next speaker is Kaysra Khan. She's an independent Islamic art curator. She's in the past worked at the British Museum and played quite a significant role in curating the Hajj exhibition in 2012. And she's going to be talking about Islamic design in Britain.
Thank you very much, Naveed. Thank you, Rowan. I wore my strawberries too today. As far as I know, I've never seen a strawberry in Islamic art, but I could be very wrong. I'll have to look out for one of those. I'd like to just start by explaining what I mean by Islamic art. It's a much disputed term, and it describes all of the arts that were produced in the lands where Islam was the dominant religion, or the religion of those who ruled. So the term is very broad, and I use it very broadly today. I'll focus now on some of the Islamic objects at the V&A and how Morris's knowledge of those objects and some of the Islamic traditions may have influenced some of his designs. And I will cover three main areas: pattern, colour and motif. So first of all, I'd like to start with one of William Morris's designs, Wild Tulip. As we know, Morris favoured patterns that assembled vegetal and floral elements with geometric precision. And as we'll go on to see with wallpapers, carpets and textiles, designs by Morris owe a great deal to Islamic decorative principles, although this has previously been rarely acknowledged. We also will see how Morris used the South Kensington Museum collections, which of course is now the V&A, as a design resource, and this had a significant and visible effect on the development of his designs. Although, of course, for him, originality was key, and there must have been careful consideration given to the method and the manner and the extent of his incorporations of Islamic-influenced designs, all in order to create beautiful design. And this Wild Tulip now I'll show as my first example. It's a wallpaper that was designed in 1884, and it's a floral design of tulip flowers and foliage with diagonally running stems of large flowers and leaves. And this has striking resemblance to the painted tulips on Iznik Ceramics from the 16th century. Now, Rowan mentioned Iznik Ceramics, and I'd just like to explain what that is. Iznik pottery is named after a town of Iznik in western Anatolia, where it was created, and where the imperial decorated ceramics were produced in the last quarter of the 15th century until the end of the 17th century. And here in the centre is an example. Floral patterns were particularly popular in Iznik ceramics, and the tulip with its elegant curling petals were especially common. It was employed on objects such as jugs and plates, as well as tiles to decorate buildings, and if anyone's been to Istanbul, you would recognise this aesthetic. The mystics in the Ottoman Empire liked to state that the flower is humble because when in bloom, it bows its head before the majesty of God. And here we can see beautiful examples of the tulip just there. So you could say that the inspiration here for Wild Tulip could point towards Iznik. But one thing I will mention, and this is a question that's been asked of William Morris before, is how can somebody who termed himself a fierce anti-Turk be so influenced by Islamic and especially Turkish Islamic design? And I'd just like to touch very briefly on this. The decorative arts of Britain and elsewhere assumed centre stage during the Great Exhibition of 1851, which Rowan spoke about. And apart from India, the other Eastern nation impinging most strongly on the British consciousness during the mid-19th century was that of Turkey. Politically, the Ottoman Empire was facing difficulties and decline, and the European nations engaged in a power struggle to safeguard their military, strategic, and commercial interests in that region and in the Ottoman domains. And of course, Ottoman Empire was famously labelled the sick man of Europe. So there became a very close link between art and race that affected the review of Turkish arts, seen by the moral difficulty in admiring the arts of the Turks. There may have been many reasons for this, of course, but we know for certain that Morris said himself that only Persia was considered, or Persian arts were considered, the utmost perfection. He was also scathing about what he terms Arab art, but whether he makes these distinctions for purely artistic or racial reasons is up for discussion. Of course, the real influences can be seen in Iznik, and their Turkish origins were persistently ignored. But a Persian origin remained the safest attribution for this kind of Oriental art, at least for people for whom racial considerations and prejudice outweighed other reasons. Of course, the use of both tulips and carnations in this design are very popular flowers in Ottoman decorative art and can be seen in the next example. Can I go back one? No. Yes. So the furnishing fabric Granada, also made in 1884, was the most technically complicated textile William Morris designed. Morris constructed a special loom to make it, but the fabric was so long to weave that it was never put into commercial production. It was also very, very expensive. Although the design influences, it's been stated by scholars previously, it could be Italian and Spanish brocaded velvets, there is no doubt that there is an influence of Islamic textiles here. Even the name is a direct reference to Islamic Spain, the designs of which were well known through Owen Jones's publication from 1842 on the Alhambra complex, which introduced the British public to the decorative possibilities through the Islamic tradition. Indeed, the success of the Alhambra installation in the exhibition of 1851 made it unsurprising that manufacturers would look for inspiration from this particular artistic tradition. I show Cray here. There we go. Ottoman textiles made in Turkey. You can see the similarities there. I show the Cray design here, also designed in 1884, because it holds a striking likeness to Islamic designs, the plumpness and the curved opulence of the carnation, and we'll see this in a moment in relation to Medway. I would just mention, actually, that the Islamic objects that I show here are all from the V&A and were all collected before 1884. So they were already in the South Kensington collection by the time Morris had come to designing his own, and he would have spent much time examining these particular objects. So if I go on to Medway here in the top right, this was also designed in 1884, 1885. And this, along with the other examples I've just shown, are part of a group of fabrics called the Thames series, which date to the period that Morris was working for the South Ken Museum, as explained. This series could be seen to have overarching Islamic influence. Here, again, we have an Iznik bowl, decorated with large styled lotus blossoms connected by a delicate floral vine in blue on a white ground. This particular type is thought to have been made in a workshop run by the master of knots and has that beautiful delicate floral spray in the background, but the similarities are quite clear. And actually, when I was looking at this, I was wondering whether Medway, could these also be lotus flowers like these, perhaps? The next subject, and Rowan touched on this also, was colour schemes. And here, like Rowan, I'd like to look at peacock and dragon. This isn't there, that's it. Peacock and dragon. This woven furnishing textile was made for use as heavyweight curtains or a wall covering. William Morris was increasingly interested in woven textiles, and that can be detected in his woven designs of the late 1870s and 1880s. And this textile was clearly influenced by a visit to Vincent Robertson's shop, which Rowan mentioned, in London, in the same year it was designed. He describes a room he saw there as from Damascus, all vermilion and gold and ultramarine, very beautiful, and it's just like going into the Arabian Nights. Although this could be also seen to be very close to Northern European sources, the dragon motif I found quite interesting, and it's also found throughout the entire Islamic world and occurs both early and late Islamic art, especially following the Mongols' incursions to the Islamic world in the 13th century. In fact, you can also see the colour palettes here, which are very similar. This object here, it was purchased after Peacock and Dragon. So it came into the South Kent collection after Peacock and Dragon, but I'm using it here as an example of one that's quite similar, especially in colour palette and perhaps the kind of thing that he would have seen. The one, however, that I find particularly fascinating is this drawing at the top here, which I found in the V&A collection. It belongs to a group of 8 sections cut from a single paper scroll before entering the museum in 1877. The whole composition is a long pictorial frieze depicting wild animals, birds, ships and monsters in a landscape designed for use in a colourful tile work or painted panels for a fashionable domestic interior in Qajar, Iran. I think that's really interesting. And here we can see a simurg, a bird, fighting a dragon. And to me, the similarities here are incredibly close. This object here, is not from the V&A, but the kind of Iznik tile, again, which looks very, very similar in terms of its colouring. This one I've added here just because, again, I find this very interesting. It's not in the V&A collection. It's from Turkey, the 15th century. It's in a collection in Berlin. And it's very likely to be a carpet woven by Armenian Christians and brought by Eastern refugees to Italy, fleeing the Ottoman incursions into the East, and is also a depiction, very stylized, graphically, of a bird up at the top and a dragon. Another design by Morris is Flower Garden. This pattern on silk, Flower Garden, was described in 1879 by William Morris when he described it in a letter to a friend. He wrote, "I'm in a whirlwind of dyeing and weaving and rather excited by a new piece which looks beautiful, like a flower garden." Morris claims to have chosen the colours to suggest the beauties of inlaid metal. They were almost certainly influenced by a display of items from Damascus he had studied in a dealer shop in London in 1878. Such as this one, also in the V&A collection and one that he perhaps would have seen. Here the technique is niello, an ornamental process of applying precious metal alloys onto brass by hammering thin wires of gold and silver into chase surfaces, which in turn are engraved. It's a costly and time-consuming craft technique reserved only for the finest courts commissioned works in the Islamic lands. Was very popular from the Middle Ages onwards, and only very few exist in the pre-Islamic period. The scholar Stephanie Bancroft suggests that his efforts to mimic the inlay seem successful. She states the combination of here dark forest green ground provides an excellent neutral background for yellow, white and grey and peach woven threads emulating gold, silver and copper. Furthermore, the subtle sheen of the silk provides yet another allusion to the fine metalwork, and it's an exquisite example of Morris using materials to their best effect. These are images, of course, that you've seen in Rowan's presentation, but I'd like to touch on and expand further on the carpets, and in particular the vase motif. Morris started making carpets and designing carpets at a relatively late stage in his career. The 1880s are the decade of his intensive activity in this medium. He was extremely knowledgeable about the history of carpet manufacture, and as we've learnt, encouraged the museum to purchase the great Ardabil carpets in 1893, recognised today as one of the finest carpets in the world. He was inspired by the workmanship of this carpet, certainly, and the main reason for him was the excellence of the design. So how did he aim to emulate these qualities in his own carpet designing and making? If we focus on the Vars carpet, they take their name from the vase, which figure fairly inconspicuously in their design. You can see here. And On this is the carpet that Rowan mentioned was in his house, and you can see some half vases along the sides here and here. The main feature is not the vase. The vase is one of the features. The main feature is a riot of blossoms, varied and many of them large in size. The large flowers are arranged on wavy stems, which intersect to form huge lattice patterns. Around those larger blossoms coil thinner stems with smaller flowers and curving leaves. They are generally attributed to Kerman in the southeast of Iran and probably originated during the reign of Shah Abbas in 1858 to 1629 and have continued since. Although the depictions of these carpets are rarely seen in European paintings, some of these carpets certainly reached Europe in the 17th century, for example, the one that we can see here. I'd like to just speak briefly about the Bullerswood carpet here, which was designed by Morris and his successor, Durl, in 1889, and is spoken of as arguably Morris's greatest achievement in terms of combining East with West. The whole effect is floral profusion. In fact, there is a change that you can discern from the all-over patterning of his carpets with dense, random floral and vegetal elements pre-1883, and from 1883 to 1889, quartered symmetry with central medallions or looping branches and leaf designs with greater resemblance to Persian medallion carpets, which a scholar, Linda Parry, suggests can be directly traced to his knowledge of Vars carpets. And actually, another very interesting thing was this flower pot embroidered by William Morrison in the V&A collection, which has, to me, remarkable likeness to this particular piece here, although it was done slightly later than this entered the collection. You can tell where the similarities and the inspiration may have come from. Of course, Morris was keenly aware that it would be nearly impossible for Morris & Co. to create carpets that could compete with historical Persian examples. He did, however, seek to balance the ornate designs of Persian carpets and his well-documented efforts to create new and innovative designs, as he was with all of his mediums. Here, although the overall effect cannot be easily connected to any specific Islamic historical design, you can, as with the rest of the images we've seen here, hopefully see the similarities.
Thank you so much, Dekesha. That's amazing. I first became... I sort of first embarked on this journey to try and understand these connections about 4 years ago when I made a documentary for Radio 4. And what was interesting is while it started out exploring all of the kind of visual connections, it ended up for me actually in that process, I began to realize a deeper understanding about perhaps the soul of Morris and my own understanding of what it means to be a Muslim in Britain, as somebody who grew up here. So what I'm going to share with you now is just some thoughts that really that I did especially for today, because it made me think again about everything I'd been through in the journey and how all these strands really come together. And when I think back, my actual first encounter with William Morris is something that I actually don't have any memory of, but I know the story because it was in 1968, and I was one year old, and I travelled with my mother, my father, and my brother on the Victoria line, and it had just opened, and we arrived at our destination, which was Walthamstow. It was the last stop on the Victoria line, and if you've ever been to the platform on the Underground, you'll know that there's benches and alcoves, and every alcove along the whole of the Victoria line has a distinct tile panel that reflects the locality. So Seven Sisters, there's actually 7 elm trees, which are the 7 Sisters, and so there's a graphic design there. And when you get to Walthamstow, there is a William Morris wallpaper design, and it's been very suitably sort of done in the late 60s tangerine and tobacco colorway, so to kind of contemporize it, and that actually was my first experience as a baby walking past, looking at William Morris, but I actually don't know if it had any impact on me at the time or not, probably not. And I'd been born in Paddington, where my parents had lived nearby in Kilburn, and they had found lodgings when they'd come from Pakistan with Irish families, because the Irish themselves had seen all of these signs of no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish, and so they'd actually made a stand to kind of let anybody come and live with them, and that's where they lived. And so as soon as my parents had saved some money and other relatives arrived, they all clubbed together and looked around London and thought, well, where should we go and move? Where can we buy a house? We need to get our own property. And there was an unfashionable corner called Walthamstow. And at that time, lots of people who lived in these very drab, horrible Victorian houses were moving away. They were going to places like Harlow and Hemel Hempstead, where there was a lot of fashionable modern architecture. In fact, that was inspired by people who did the Bauhaus, who actually loved Morris themselves. So it's a kind of quite interesting sort of loop there. And my father and my uncle bought a house, a large two-storey Victorian house that had 7 rooms, and we arrived and we moved into one of the rooms, and 5 other families lived with us in this house, and my uncle took 2 rooms, and there were a few other families who moved into there, and we had 1 room, and in that my brother, my parents, and myself, we all lived there. And I still meet people from that time, and now there's something like close to about 400 or 500 people who have emerged from those 5 families who all live in East London, and actually they all remember it as a very, very amazing time where people struggled to settle into Britain, but also raise their children in a very strange way. Nothing like what they had, the childhoods that they had had. A few years later, my dad had enough money to kind of buy a house of his own. He had 3 kids, so he moved out of that house, and he chose something near the local park, which is called Lloyd's Park. And that's because at the end of the road we could go and the kids could go and play. What he didn't realise was actually at the front of Lloyd's Park is Waterhouse, where Rowan works, where the William Morris Gallery is. So we, even though Morris had only been there for a very short time, Walthamstow's really grabbed that and claimed it for its own and claimed Morris for themselves. And I think the actual gallery was sort of opened in the 50s by Clement Attlee at the time, who was the local MP, and has an amazing collection. If you haven't been, you really, really should visit. So I spent most of my childhood walking past the William Morris Gallery on the way to the park. I'd go after school, I'd go at the weekends, I'd go every school holiday. Often the school holidays were spent in the park. I never went on holiday. We would just, we were poor. We just didn't have the money to go back to Pakistan. We couldn't afford it. It was the 70s. I went on an odd trip to Stoke, where I had relatives who worked in the potteries. But other than that, my childhood was really a London childhood, and occasionally my father worked as a tandoori chef in central London, so I'd go up and along the Victoria line. But the park represented a lot of freedom and space that I kind of couldn't really experience in sort of terrace houses in Walthamstow. I had no idea what that building was. I never really thought about it. So when I was about 7, we actually went on a school trip, and it was just around the corner, so we went into the gallery, and I was just flabbergasted, because it was the first time I'd actually realised that there was such a thing called a gallery or a museum, that you could walk around and look at these objects. And I actually also experienced for the first time what it must be that this is how English people live. Because the inside of our house was actually something like what people lived in Pakistan. They'd sort of done very similar kind of colours and ideas, and we lived like that. So the whole of our interior life was really about, you come through this door, when you're in here, you're in Pakistan. That's what we're trying to create here for you. So there was a kind of grand staircase and dark furniture and stuff, and it was quite inspiring. So the next weekend, I pestered my mum again and again. Look, we've got to go in that building. And she was like, "You've got to be joking. What is that? Are we allowed? We're not supposed to do things like that." And it was also her first experience of actually understanding what the purpose of a museum or a gallery was. And she was incredibly nervous. All the attendants wore hats and uniforms, and that was like, look, we better not go near these people. We'll be in trouble. So over a period of time, it lost that formality, and she actually relaxed and began to really look at the objects and found an affinity with what was in that gallery. I mean, it could have been the Museum of Engineering, which I think it wouldn't have had the same impact to any of us at that time, you know. But the fact it was that she found something that connected her back to what she was homesick for, and found some kind of identity in what Morris was doing. And I mean, she never really spoke about it, but I got it because it became a favourite place. I mean, we'd often go there if it was raining in the park. We'd go and have a little wander around, and we'd also go and just the smell, the musty smell of the old furniture would be quite sort of, it was a very different thing. But it became part of my mental map of how I belonged in the world and how I belonged in Walthamstow in London. And there were whole bits where I wasn't really welcome in the 70s, so I would stay out of those. Those were dangerous bits. But this was a great place, a place of actually beautiful objects and a place to kind of really marvel at the richness of what was there. So if you fast forward now to 1982, I'm now 15, the specials are in the charts. Tottenham make it into the FA Cup final, second year in a row, and I actually start at a new school getting ready for my O-levels, and it's called the William Morris Technical School. It's in the borough, it's named after the great man. Every morning I have to walk past William Morris's bust, and I go over to do the art classes, which I'm really good at. And I'm actually enjoying, and there is a whole framed collection of Morris's wallpapers, and we learn about Morris. And, you know, even though I'm interested in art and design, my parents are like, no, it's economics and medicine and law, and that's what the whole point was of coming to Britain. It wasn't for you to, you know, what the hell is design anyway? So they're just not really interested. But my connection with Morris there is I'm just still oblivious to him. By this time, I'm way too hormonal. I'm angsty, I'm self-conscious, and I can't really think about it. I'm sort of really caught between this sort of life of the Pakistani village that my parents had come from, and actually what I see on TV is how ordinary people live. And my school is this sort of explosive cocktail of just different tribes: Pakistanis, West Indian, East End Barrow boys, Essex aspirationals, and a constant sort of demands of me having to make decisions between, do I want a girlfriend or an arranged marriage? Do I want to watch Top of the Pops or go to the mosque? Do I want to eat curry every night, as we did, or burger and chips like my friends were? Do I watch a Bollywood film or go and watch Star Wars? And I constantly sort of having to juggle between living between these two places. And in time, I didn't never realise I just get really good at it, you know, because initially it causes so much problems for me. And it all comes to an abrupt end when I'm in the sixth form, having enrolled for A-levels in economics and accounts. And I just can't get the guns versus butter argument anymore, and I don't understand why I'm not making sense of this. So then I start hanging around with a bunch of Asian bad lads, and the race riots around that time in the early 80s had actually sort of really made my generation come to a prominence, where we weren't going to have that kind of passive tolerance. My father always said, look, we're going to go back, so there's no point causing a fuss here. But we thought, look, we're not going anywhere. This is our home. We're going to stand up for our rights. But these bad lads, they actually weren't any freedom fighters or anything kind of noble like that. They were actually just kids looking for a release, because they also felt this intense pressure that we all had in terms of which way are you and where you're going to go. And we were all entering into adulthood being really denied any outlet. We didn't drink, we couldn't smoke, we couldn't do all of this. And actually what the result was that there was a lot of petty crime and drinking. Not the kind of thing a young, respectable Muslim boy, especially not like me, you know, should be involved with. And what I actually witnessed was slowly, one by one, a lot of people I was around get arrested, you know. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm not really justified in being around these guys, because I've actually got really nice parents. They're very lovely to me. They've given me a lot of space and love, and they've always cared about my future, and they've wanted to do the best for me, other than the fact they won't let me study design. Also, all the time, all these kids were doing these bad things, I was crapping myself. I kind of really am not suited to kind of doing illegal activity. It just doesn't suit my personality. And I thought, well, how am I in this mess? Because I just don't like economics. I've sort of drifted off, you know. We go, and I can remember this moment. We walked off into this we went to this newsagent, and one or two of us went in there. And while they were, you know, getting whatever they were buying, I looked over and saw a Habitat catalogue. It was like, dumbstruck. So I sort of looked around what he was looking and picked this thing up, flicked through it, and then came back and asked the guy to put it in a brown paper bag. Took it home immediately. You know, I'm 16, I kind of hid it under the bed, made sure no one... I locked the door, opened it up. Unbelievable, you know. Wow, people live like this. who are these people? You know, beautiful, matte black, pine furniture. You know, so I see kind of, you know, Terence Conran, who the hell's this? You know, what is all of this? And I actually discover, you know, finally sort of design. It kind of comes into my life, and I realise this is something people live like this. People aspire to these things, and it creates a better life. And of course, it sort of just sets me on this path. So I tell my mum, my dad, look, I'm dropping out. I can't, you know, I'm not going to pass these exams. I don't understand anything. And I go off to the local art college, Walthamstow Art College, and I say, look, I don't know, how do I get in? And they say, well, you need a portfolio first, and you'll have to apply the next year. So I go home, I frivolously work, sit the test, get through, and they say, well, you know, do you want to do fine art or sculpture? No, interior design. Interior design. I come home and tell my dad, and like, we're Pakistanis, interior design? How am I going to show my face in the mosque? You know, what is this? And of course, you know, at that time, it's also associated with sort of, you know, like, you know, textiles and carpets and things, not quite manly, you know. We're actually from the northwest frontier, Pathan tribes, we're macho guys, but they sort of accept it, you know, fine, it's okay. And then I sort of do life drawing at school and come home and hide it under my bed. And my mother says, look, just don't show your father, you know. I hope this works out. And I go off, I get into university. I'm the first in the whole of my family to get into university. And of course, they just keep it really quiet. They don't, you know, we have grocery shops, and it's like, oh, so is he doing law or economics? No, what's that? Interior design. It's an incredible sort of embarrassment. And, you know, and then that's where I'm able to kind of really understand the value of Morris, and I sort of dig down. But as I was making the program I was doing, you know, it just always came back to me that actually the second half of his life, this struggle for socialism and for justice, etc., it's very much in that sense of what young Muslims are aspiring for, what they're looking for, and people who've suffered from racism and inequality. But also this kind of idea of just being a grumpy sod, where you actually sit around and you think these cushions are horrible, this sofa's tawdry, you don't like anything, and then you fix your environment first, and then you're feeling all comfortable and cozy and everything's just perfect, and then you look outside and you realise actually the world's not right, and you can't stop. And he just kind of goes on this incredible drive, and it's really this thing that really, really connected me with him, as well as all of those other connections for it. And I think what you really get is that he sort of really sees this idea that actually the beauty isn't just simply about what you're seeing with your eyes, it's also actually the beauty of the system, the beauty of the people that work there, the justice that can provide for them, the dignity that it gives them. And really, for me, in the end, the message I take away is that he's one of the first people that who you walk into a room, and he just gets it right. There's Sussex chairs, there's Gothic oak settles, there's Indian textiles, and there's Persian carpets, and they're living harmoniously in one space. And I think it's just such a metaphor for what we're trying to achieve. And actually we have. If you come to Walthamstow, you're all welcome. Rowan has a fantastic gallery, and, you know, I'll come and have a cup of tea with you, but we have that. We've actually managed to have that. We live in one of the, probably the best multi-faith, multi-cultured societies in the world there now. And that's evolved. And I think Morris really is sort of, for me, my hero. And I made that program saying to a lot of young Muslims who are looking for that identity, look, this is the man that we should all aspire to. So thank you very much. We can have some questions. We've got about 5 minutes, so we'll take some questions.
Hello.
Thanks very much. Thank you, guys. I was just wondering, in your mind, when does inspiration turn into cultural appropriation? Is there a line? Is it very blurry? What do you think?
It's a hard one to start with.
Yeah, I think what I try to point out quite strongly in the presentation, and also Rowan will be able to tell you more about this in terms of William Morris's ethic and his principle was to create something that was original. And that's not to say that to have inspiration can't create something original. And that was much of his, the main principle behind his work, that he wanted to create new things. But at the same time, one thing that people have said about his inspiration from Islamic art is that it marries the East and the West into something that was completely unique at the time. That's not to say that he lifted things and just applied them, but that he shifted and changed things so much. And perhaps the evidence of that is the fact that no one has really spoken about that Islamic art influence until very recently. So it could be that actually he did that far too well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think I sort of touched on the thing of being inspired but learning, and I think that's what Morris does. It's easy to think about Morris looking back to, for example, medieval time, and he has a romantic idea about it, but it's also very much rooted in society and how things are made. And he has, as much as he's inspired by patterns that he sees around him from historic textiles and examples, the way he learns how things are made means that he can learn how to use the best of those to create something new. So he has a fundamental understanding. He is always trying to understand how things are made so he can make them anew.
I think a lot of these discussions have been obviously in a very political consciousness and political context. But I think for myself personally, as somebody who, has, I was here last year and I said, look, I'm 100% Pakistani, I'm 100% Muslim, and I'm 100% British. And I'm probably 10% Japanese and 15% Dutch. And, so I think this idea of inspiration versus, appropriation, to me, it's about love. If he clearly loved that carpet. He clearly loved those things. He had them in his house, and he admired them, and he wanted them. And so I think when someone has that there is an affinity. And what could be wrong with that? What could be wrong with us sharing and learning from that? So I mean, I have a brother-in-law who's English. He's married to my wife's sister, but he. I can't stand hot curry. He loves it. He absolutely loves it. I'm like, you can have mine. I don't want to. So it's just, it's the age we're living in, a globalized world. And I think these things just don't matter anymore.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for that incredible lecture that you gave to us today. I just wanted to say that you are an incredibly valuable person to the English society, because you have brought what is missing in this day and age, a golden heart and sunshine to an area in London which was very, very difficult to live in. I actually live quite near there, further south, and I've seen that area change hugely. And I think for us to have you as a representative of an Englishman, William Morris, is so valuable. And if only more people became like you about things, about plants, about creatures, about everything, we would have a very different world, not based on appropriation. I took my mother to the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris because I wanted to show her some things. And my mother was completely different to me. She's from a different generation, a different culture. Everything we looked at, first of all, Institut du Monde Arabe was a dead place. There were objects there that they had collected from all over the world, but the place had no soul. And everything my mother saw, she said, well, they've stolen that from us, and they've stolen, oh, that was ours, and they took that from us, and of course, this belongs to us. And I just thought, this is just so wrong. The attitude is so wrong. And what that question you threw up today, I think, I'm sorry, I'm blaring on, but may I give somebody else? I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm honoured. Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion about where did this come from? You know, how did these collections arrive here? And it's an area that Keisha will know a lot more about. But often when I've heard these criticisms, because there's plenty of people in my community who say, look, this is just imperial booty. You know, to the victor, the spoils. People have just taken this and brought it here. And actually, when you actually go into the collections, you realise the extent to which people paid to buy this because they love it. And it was like, this means that you've arrived, that when you can buy a Persian carpet for your house, when you can put beautiful Iznik tiles in there. And so that wasn't something that they just found out, we conquered these lands and we brought it back. And that's one of the discussions, obviously, in my community with a lot of younger people. I said, look, this is nothing to do with that. This is absolutely people loving what they see and having value in it. And that needs to be something that you need to take pride in, you know. So, yeah. Thank you.
Quick one. What do you have in your house?
I do have a lot of Pakistani textiles, heritage from there. I actually live about 2 minutes walk from the gallery still, and it's a 1913 Edwardian house, which we've put back the aesthetic movement tiles wherever we can find them. We try to restore it back as authentically as possible. And actually, that's what's so amazing about a lot of the properties that we have here, is the sense of how easy it is to add, you know, to blend all of that. And I think for me, that's also symbolic. We absolutely respect the heritage that was there when we've arrived. So we don't want to put onion domes on top of it. We want it to kind of look exactly like it was. And in fact, if you go down my road, you will notice little mehrabs that have been cut into the things. There's actual tessellated tile panels, which, you know, Daltons were producing, which are copied from the Alhambra. So it's already got touches of it that feel like that. But you know, we all of us who live in the house are British. We're English. We absolutely embrace that fully. But we have a heritage as well that is part, and we make that work in a way that's pleasant to us. Yeah. But other than my wife and myself argue over colour, so that's it. Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you, too, for the lecture. I simply wonder how you, and indeed your fellow lecturers, can reconcile your love for Morris with his dislike for Islam, or rather Turkey.
I touched upon that. I think it's really a matter of extracting what was very much a political concept in that period of time, and certainly for 19th century, for Victorian England, for Victorian Britain, that was really the general political outlook. And so it's very difficult to finger point Morris, I think. It's difficult to finger point him in any respect, but I think it's difficult to really try and understand where that was coming from exactly. I don't know if we know for certain whether there was a dislike for Islam, but we know for certain there was a dislike for the Ottoman Empire and what was becoming the decline and the piecemeal nature of this Ottoman decline, and the British interest in commercial interest and political interest. So I think it was really part of the political climate, and also a real love for Persia. I was just saying this morning that it seems to be that there's a political vacuum in terms of Iran during this period, and so it's not so much at the forefront of the bad part of the mentality in terms of the Eastern world or the Islamic world. So it seems that then everything good comes from Persia. For example, even objects that people recognised, or for example Morris recognised, were made in Turkey, were often thought of as being made by a Persian in Turkey. So that's the extent of the dislike of the Ottoman Empire. I don't think that necessarily boils down to a dislike of the artistic tradition, clearly not, given how much inspiration was taken from Iznik textiles and Iznik ceramics. So I think it's very difficult. You really need to take the political climate into account in this case.
I think it's such a poignant question because it's actually what many of us who are here today also face this as a reality. And the fact of the matter is, as a practicing Muslim, as a lover of Islamic art, I also dislike many Muslim countries. You know, I'm absolutely fully expressed as a Muslim here in a secular space, and I respect that. I really value that I've been given those freedoms. But if there's many Islamic republics that I wouldn't want to be living under, socially, in terms of culturally, I wouldn't want to be living under them. On another level, there's many Islamic republics that I don't agree with politically in any way. But I think there's a sense of what we have is actually we are moving out of that meta-narrative of, you know, these blocks of understanding, that this monolithic, everything in that country must be wrong, to a point of sophisticated understanding about the political difficulties of people who are, you know, the challenges of the people who are running them, their decisions, and often the people living underneath it, right down to the artisan. And I think clearly there is a sort of a sense of respect, global respect of the artisan, which is outside of what label you want to attach to it. It becomes almost like a universal language of just people pursuing beauty and pursuing the expression of that beauty. So, you know, that's how I see it. I just think Morris's political views are very distinct, and they're very much about social justice. But his love of these objects is just something that, you know, it's a personal thing.
I'm so sorry to call an end to what has been a completely fantastic and fascinating event, but I'm afraid we do have to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have a huge hand for our three speakers who've been brilliant. Thank you so much.